Happy Monday, everyone. This is Ethan Westerman filling in as host today. Regular season is over for Arkansas men's basketball. Finished up the regular season at Missouri with an 88-84 win in overtime. Now it's on to the postseason with the SEC tournament starting this week. And then, of course, after that, that's whenever the big dance starts. Anthony, happy to have you with me today on the show. And you were there in Columbia. I don't know, you've had a couple days to maybe reflect on that game a little bit now. What are the main things that kind of stuck with you from, that last game of the regular season for the Razorbacks?
Well, the first thing that sticks with me is the fact that the Wi-Fi just straight didn't work for most of the day. So that made it a little difficult to do things. Just talking about the game just in general, Arkansas was without Darius Acuff, and the big question going into it was, how would they play? How do they replace that production? And DJ Wagner and Malik Thomas were both going to have the ball in their hands a lot more without Darius Acuff, being available. And I thought that was the biggest thing that you notice is just how, I guess, prepared, Malik Thomas was, especially. He scored 30 points, and he had a really nice night just offensively. I believe he had an assist as well. DJ Wagner scored 10 points on 10 shots, so not necessarily the most efficient shooting night, but he had a team high in assists. And I thought he had a decent night defensively as well. And to go on the road and get a win over a projected tournament team, without your potential player of the year, I thought that was a really impressive performance from them. And then I thought Malik Ewan had a really good game. I thought Trevin Brazil had a good game. I thought Nick Pringle had some nice moments as well. So getting those guys going and playing well is obviously going to be important as you get into postseason. But yeah, I think those are probably all the things that stick out immediately beyond just the Wi-Fi concerns that we had.
Yeah, and it's funny because, kind of going into this game, and I think that if there were larger implications for Arkansas as far as we knew they were going to either be the 2 or the 3 seed. They could have lost this game, and just how things shook out, I believe, still been the 3 seed. It was one of those things going into it where it was kind of like you knew by not playing Darius Acuff that the implications, you're valuing the health of your really good player over maybe, another W on the win-loss column, because it wasn't super influential for Arkansas with at least what it has going on in the postseason. But for Missouri, on the other hand, this was actually a pretty big game for them, because I believe they were in a weird situation going into the day where they could have finished anywhere from 4th to 10th in the SEC. So that's a difference in a couple days of rest. I guess from your perspective, it seemed like it was at least from the TV, a phenomenal crowd there. It was senior day, I know. It felt like it was a lot to play for Missouri. So I guess for Arkansas to even have a game where you don't have your normal, you don't have Darius Acuff, and you're really relying on some other people more. I guess, what did you learn about this team in the fact that they were able to win without him? And it wasn't like a game where, they're playing a team that didn't have something to play for.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that, you have the option if he's playing poorly, or if his shot's just not falling, or whatever it may be, if he's out for any other reason, you're not staring down disaster necessarily. They went on the road, like you said, in a very hostile environment against a team that had a lot to play for, and still got out of it with a really nice win, I thought. And it showed, and not that we didn't know this before, but it showed that you can rely really heavily upon Malik Thomas to have those big games offensively if Darius Acuff isn't going to be available, or is maybe not having his best shooting night, or whatever it may be. So I think those are all. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we learned, per se. And yeah, you just look at, just everything else that kind of transpired. Trevin Brazil having a really nice game, back where he started his career. And DJ Wagner, like we mentioned, having a nice defensive game, having a nice distribution game, even though the shot wasn't necessarily, falling at a high clip.
Played
But I
all
think,
45 minutes.
yeah, exactly. So I think that there shows you just how much, how valuable he was on the floor. So I think all of that is maybe not necessarily things that we didn't know going into it, but I think it's, I think it, I guess just gave it a bigger spotlight given Darius Acuff wasn't available for that game. And I think that's a promising thing for Arkansas when you look down the stretch. Obviously, the SEC tournament, they're going to have the double bye, have 2 days off, and could potentially have a nice showing there. You get to the NCAA tournament, and if things aren't going well for him individually, he doesn't have to be the hero. He could defer and you know give the ball to Malik Thomas. I mean, not that you necessarily want to take the ball out of Darius Acuff's hands, just because he's had maybe some inefficient nights from very rare time to time, but still has come up with big shots. So but it shows you that it doesn't need to be maybe one dimensional, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like for Malik Thomas especially, which I know you were all over this. Initially, they gave him 28 points. That got changed to 30, right?
Yes, yeah. They initially credited a first half basket, I think with about 6 minutes left, to Trevin Brazil when it was actually Malik Thomas who scored.
Yeah. Well, Malik Thomas, it felt to me in that game, which we saw this actually a little bit. Obviously Darius Acuff had the game of probably the year, at least in the SEC against Alabama, even though it came in a loss, to where you just knew who kind of needed the ball in his hands. But Malik Thomas in that game, I remember, also wanted the ball in his hands because he was making shots. And he actually, he made that three-pointer that Calipari called a timeout right before down there in Tuscaloosa. And he's, for a freshman, he's one that it just feels like he wants that moment. And in Missouri, without Darius Acuff in the equation, I think it maybe, at least to me, felt like freed him up to know that he just kind of was that guy. Like, he was their best scoring option. And I mean, obviously he had a huge game, 5 of 6 from 3. And there was that stretch in the game where it felt like it didn't matter what he was taking. He was making it. I guess for him to have that type of game to where we know Darius Acuff can take over a game. I feel like this was we've seen it, obviously Malik Thomas be able to score the ball this year, but there just hadn't, at least in my opinion, been that type of game yet to where it was like, all right, Malik Thomas, you take over this a little bit. And it feels like we kind of got that.
Yeah, I think there's been moments in which he's had spurts of that. You mentioned the Alabama game. I think there was a stretch where he scored, 6, 8 points in a row, if not like a good portion of points over a stretch for Arkansas. So, we've seen it in I guess blips, if you will. And yeah, the game, at Missouri without Darius Acuff, and it gave him the opportunity to, I guess, just be the guy for the entire day. And I think that it just goes to show that that is an option for him to be. Obviously, Darius Acuff is going to be that guy when he's on the floor, and for good reason. There's a reason he's going to be most likely a lottery pick in the NBA draft in June. So, that's not to say, get the ball out of Darius Acuff's hands. Give it to Malik Thomas at all times because, I mean, you want the ball in Darius Acuff's hands. But, Malik Thomas is that kind of guy who, can and, probably will at some point or just did, you know, take over a game and really, really show just how good of a player he is because, there have been times this year where maybe he hasn't gotten, as much shine just because of how much of the attention goes to Darius Acuff. And, you know, you know, yeah, and he just went out and showed that he's, he's very capable of having those kinds of performances. And I thought that was really, really good for him to show that he, can do that. And he's had good performances before. Like we mentioned, Alabama, he had 24 points. He had 21 against South Carolina, but South Carolina, stinks. I thought he was great against James Madison in non-conference play. I thought that was another instance in where it showed that he could, have those kinds of games. Winthrop, I thought he was huge. If Arkansas loses that game to Winthrop, if you remember, that was 84-83 in a big time upset bid. How different are we looking at Arkansas? Is that a seed line bump from a 5 down to a 6? Maybe, but a big reason for that is because, a big reason why that isn't the case is because Malik Thomas had a really nice game there. And then I thought Nick Pringle had some really good plays in that game as well down the stretch. But he's shown that he can do that. But this I feel like is probably the most high profile of those examples.
Yeah, and what I think was encouraging, at least for Arkansas, its postseason outlook from this game is I felt like Saturday was an instance of, you know, everybody kind of wondered like what would this team even look like without Darius Acuff, because a lot of times there is that real like kind of oh crap moment, I think, whenever you don't have a player that's been that good for you, just like what does this look like? And it just felt like a game where Arkansas understood its personnel, at least in that game, of like Malik Thomas needed to be putting up more shots. The big men stepped up. It just felt like the type of game where you at least saw Arkansas in real time adjust to a different looking lineup than what we're used to.
Yeah, and talking to Malik Thomas after the game, he had talked about how they had been working on that, how they had been working on, playing without Darius Acuff for extended periods of time, and I thought that was very evident. It didn't look like there was any confusion as to what the roles were going to be, in that game. And they've played well without Darius Acuff in the past as well. If you remember the home game against Missouri, Darius Acuff sat the last 5 minutes and 20 seconds of the first half in that game, and Arkansas went on a 19-6 run. So, I don't know if that's I don't know if that's becoming a Missouri thing or if that's just the case. But yeah, we've seen it a couple of times this season where they've gotten some good showings without Darius Acuff on the floor, but like we keep saying, you want Darius Acuff on the floor as much as you can, especially in these high pressure moments that are going to be coming in the SEC and NCAA tournaments. So, but yeah, it did show that they're prepared. Everybody seems to know their roles whenever there's a given five on the floor. And yeah, like you said, I feel like from an Arkansas perspective, I felt like that was really encouraging.
Yeah, and it's for me it was also the fact that they didn't it's not like they adjusted in the game to like what is life without Darius Acuff. Like they threw the first punch at least in that game, and it was Missouri that honestly had to make those adjustments to really tighten things up, by the end of the first half, and obviously they took the lead in the second half. And part of the reason for Arkansas taking that early first lead was obviously Trevin Brazile, who came up big for them at the end of the game too with that 3-pointer. But I forget how many he had in the first half, but he was all over the stat sheet. For as much as like rightfully so a week ago, we were talking about the Arkansas front court and how much it just got bullied at Florida, and there's no real other way to put it that they weren't even a match for them. They had a really good bounce back week between what Trevin Brazile did on his senior night against Texas, and then at Missouri, Trevin Brazile and Malik Ewan was huge, and Nick Pringle made some plays. I know Nick Pringle fouled out, which is pretty. It's not like crazy that Nick Pringle fouled out, but he had good plays before that happened. I feel like the Arkansas front court against Missouri, that might have been, probably the most encouraging development, I would think, for Arkansas. Like, I know Mark Mitchell had 32 points, and I don't know how many Sean Phillips had, but I think Arkansas out-rebounded them, and Arkansas had big men that stepped up. It wasn't like it just felt like a good bounce-back week for them. There's still obviously questions for the postseason, how they'll fare against, some of those really elite big men in the nation. But I would, at least with what had just happened, I'd have to think this past week was a step in the right direction.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I mean, especially, like you mentioned it with the front courts that they went up against. I mean, Texas with Matas Vokatitis and all the guys there who I don't know if you just heard that ding on my laptop. I apologize if you did. I thought it went into automatically DND when I was on a Zoom. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, you look at Texas with its front court. I mean, obviously, Matas Vokatitis, Dalen Swain, guys who can really hurt you. In those kinds of moments. Camden Heide as well. A really experienced guy. And then Missouri with like you mentioned, Mark Mitchell and Sean Phillips and everybody they've got there. Trent Pierce. I mean, Missouri's got one of the biggest lineups in the country. And Arkansas, and like we mentioned, I mean, Mark Mitchell, I thought had a phenomenal game, and he's very much well worth being an All SEC selection in my opinion, and he's been a big reason why Missouri's turned around its season. Um, but yeah, you look at just how well Arkansas's front court bounced back after really uh, kind of a bad performance against Florida, just to put it frankly. I thought that was impressive, encouraging, and Florida is, Florida has the number one front court in the country in my eyes. I mean, you look at some of the other teams around the country, you're going to throw Michigan into that conversation. You're going to throw probably Arizona into that conversation, Houston. You know, you would have Texas Tech in there if JT Toppin wasn't injured, and obviously that stinks for Texas Tech, but Arkansas beat Texas Tech with JT Toppin on the floor, but
Hmm.
also Luke Bamgoy wasn't available in that game for Texas Tech, so I guess there's some give and take. But anyway, good front court performance, for from the Arkansas big guys this past week, and yeah, like you mentioned, I feel like it's an encouraging sign to see that when you're going into the postseason, when you're going to see a lot of big time elite front courts down the stretch if you make a run.
This literally just in while we are recording this, Malik Thomas was named SEC Freshman of the Week. So how about that?
Oh,
With 30 points, I know Anthony will be all over that as soon as we finish
know what I'm
this
doing when
show.
I'm here.
But yeah, all that to say, really good game for Malik Thomas. He's the type of freshman that honestly, I've been saying this all year about Malik Thomas that if this was a different year, like there's so many just star freshmen this year that it is crazy to me that Malik Thomas, with what he's doing, he kind of fades into like a little bit of a background role nationally. And it is
Yeah,
crazy to me because
for
he's,
him to not be projected as a first round pick is kind of wild.
yeah, and the fact
When
that he
yeah.
is having the year that he's having and we don't hear about him more is just, it just goes to show, I think, how many elite freshmen there are this year. Because I think you could throw Malik Thomas in a lot of these other recent freshman classes and he's like a headliner.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Like I said, it's kind of crazy to think about how, you know, and obviously this is because of just how loaded this freshman class is, but like, he's not a projected first round pick right now, in most mock drafts. I mean, you look at just kind of around the country, like Tunde Yesufu, yeah, Baylor stinks, but he's been phenomenal, and you don't really hear a lot about him either. Ibuka Okori at Stanford is probably a guy who is probably getting more hype on NBA draft radars than maybe people think, but is not really a guy you hear a lot about, probably because Stanford's also not that great. But no, I mean Malik Thomas has been phenomenal, and maybe it comes down to just the freshman class being what it was. Like, I mean, I think right now 9 of the first 10 picks in the NBA draft are projected to be current freshmen. And I mean, yeah, like you said, if this was a normal freshman class, you're probably hearing, a ton more about him. And so I mean, and maybe that helps too. Maybe not having that big of a spotlight on you at all times, helps with his development. I don't know. That's not something I've asked him about, and maybe it's something I should have asked him about after the Missouri game. But yeah, but he's been phenomenal, and he's deserving of that kind of spotlight. Whether or not he's gotten it to this stage of the season yet, I think is irrelevant to the fact that he has been one of the most important players Arkansas has had, and with regard to the success Arkansas has had this season as well. So yeah, I don't even remember what the original point was. I've just started yapping. But yeah, no, when you look at him in regard to this freshman class, he's still, among the better players in the class. It's just that there's there are so many really good elite freshmen in this class it's sometimes, especially when one of the best is also your teammate, it might be easy for a guy like him to maybe go a little under the radar. And like I said, maybe that's helped him, develop a little bit outside of the spotlight, or not outside of the spotlight because people still talk about him, but not as much of the spotlight. But, like I said, I should have asked him about that after the Missouri game, and I didn't. So
Oh,
maybe I'm doing my job, but it is what
well,
it is.
want to tell you about our friends at Bentonville Glass, serving its community since 1971. Bentonville Glass is committed, professional, and versatile. Looking for a quality leader in Northwest Arkansas? Looking for skilled craftsmanship? Choose Bentonville Glass for all your glass market needs with the highest quality products. You can come by and see them today at 507 South Main in Bentonville or online at bentonvilleglass.com. Anthony, before we land this plane today, we got to talk about the SEC tournament a little bit. Obviously, Arkansas earns the 3 seed, and not good for us, or for the sleepy
Well,
eyes of Razorback fans, because they will be playing, like they throw this estimated time out there of 8:30 p.m. Central, but it really could be later because it's just 30 minutes after the 6 p.m. game ends, which I just have a hard time thinking that they're going to start on time at 8:30. Maybe I'll be shocked, but Alabama will play somebody right before Arkansas on the same court, and then 30 minutes after that, then it's time for the Razorbacks. They're the 3 seed. If they win, then they would move to the semifinals because they got the double bye, so they're already well along into the quarterfinals of this bracket. And then obviously the semifinals is at 2:30 p.m. Central on Saturday, and if they win that, they would go to the championship at noon Central on Sunday. You kind of look at this path that maybe the Razorbacks could have to get to that title game. What stands out to you from the bracket?
yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing that you look at is, the potential matchups that they would have on Friday, and that would be Texas A&M, South Carolina, or Oklahoma. And I mean, they went 3-0 against those teams, and I mean, the most trouble they had was with Oklahoma. And Oklahoma's been playing a lot better of late. I think they've won 6 of the previous 8 games, and have really kind of turned it around. So
They're a
probably
team. I feel like there's not a whole lot of teams going into this SEC tournament as far as NCAA. I know Auburn's one of them, but it feels to me like Oklahoma, they're not getting mentioned too much right now, but
no,
they're
so
going to go into there thinking that they could make
they
some
have a chance.
noise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, they're playing really well, and I think that's maybe a credit to Porter Moser for getting them to, forget the really bad start they had to league play. I think they started 0-9 in SEC play, and then to turn it around and having won, like I said, I think it's 6 of 8 games, if I'm not mistaken, to finish SEC play, and so that's yeah, it's impressive to a turnaround. I don't think that's a team that's going to be in the tournament or anywhere near the tournament, but regardless, it's still, they're playing well. They're in some of the best form in the SEC entering the tournament, maybe besides like Florida, just from a strict, wins and losses basis from the previous 10 or so games or whatever. But anyway, yeah, I mean, Arkansas went 3-0 against the teams that it could face on Friday. So that's, something to monitor. That's a team or and yeah, I mean A&M's obviously, had a really nice season under Bucky McMillan, especially with how late he got hired. South Carolina has been pretty bad again, just like it was last year, but I believe finished 14th in the league after being finished or picked 16th, so maybe some overachievement, if you want to call it that. Even though they do stink. But yeah, you look at that and on paper, it's favorable. Obviously, tournament basketball, anything can happen. So there is that. And then, if they're to go to the semifinal, they'd see probably Alabama again, but then they'd also have the opportunity of Georgia, which obviously those are 2 teams that they lost to. And then, there's Ole Miss and Texas there as well, who, are the potential opponents if you're going to get to semifinal Saturday. But I think the main thing that you look at from an Arkansas perspective, with this bracket is, the that first potential matchup with any of A&M, South Carolina, or Oklahoma, just because I mean those are 3 teams that you've already seen and beaten. And for the most part, you did so with, I don't want to say relative ease because I mean nothing really necessarily comes easy, but you did, you handled your business if you're Arkansas in those games. So you probably like that, those are your potential matchups going into the tournament.
Yeah, I honestly, I mean, maybe people have differing opinions on conference tournaments for teams that are like Arkansas that already have an auto bid. I or are not gonna have an auto bid, but are gonna be a at large
Yeah,
bid. I love a conference tournament because they're fun, and obviously I think you want to win it. But I personally think that bigger than any win that Arkansas will get at this tournament is the fact that that they won last Wednesday and secured a double bye and rested Darius Acuff, and so and then they don't play till Friday because of a double bye. I feel like that's the real win here for Arkansas is that they are getting some much needed rest. And they won't have to play until Friday. Say they had to play in Oklahoma or somebody. If they played in Oklahoma or South Carolina, that would be a team that had played 2 days in a row, and then you're getting a rested Darius Acuff back. I just feel like that rest element for Arkansas this time of year, that was what was so huge about securing a double bye.
Yeah, no, for sure. And sometimes you can see teams make runs, right? I mean, look at the Sun Belt, Georgia Southern, five wins in
Watch
5 days
that.
to make it to the championship game, which is so fun. And they're playing Troy tonight, so I'll be locked in on Georgia Southern versus Troy while everybody else is doing productive things. But um, yeah, I mean, so teams can make runs, right? I mean, it's happened, and it will continue to happen. That's just the nature of college basketball. But I think you'd much rather have the rest than not, and especially when Darius Acuff has been in a boot, and they've been talking about how he could have sat out against Florida or sat out against Texas and whoever, and to have clinched the double bye with the win over Texas and just you know basically have had the 3 seed locked in, going into the Missouri game with, the opportunity of getting the 2 seed with a win and Alabama losing to Auburn. And, I mean, let's be honest, Alabama was never going to lose to Auburn in that game. I mean, that was, having watched it, I know the final score was closer than what the game kind of felt. But
Kind of like Arkansas, Florida the weekend before.
yes,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
much so. Yeah, so long story short, you very much vastly prefer having the rest, and especially, with Darius Acuff getting, I guess, something of extended rest without having to play, in that Missouri game. So I think that is definitely big, and you definitely want to get out of the SEC tournament healthy, with the NCAA tournament right around the corner as well. So yeah, they've gotten, a lot of what they want, I think, is the main story of the day.
Anthony, all that I know is it is the best time of year right now. I'm having a lot of fun watching conference tournaments, especially the ones where like I said, for Arkansas, a team like them, it doesn't carry as much weight as some of these smaller conferences where teams are going out there and they know their season is over if they don't win. I love this time of year, and so it's one of those deals where like SEC tournament, like I don't know if it's really even ideal sometimes to play all the way to the championship and be tired for NCAA, but they're fun nonetheless. Like I love a conference tournament, so I know
And
you are a junkie of them too.
oh yeah, and it's still. I mean, there's a few teams where, I mean, this week is going to be big for them in their at-large chances. Like, I mean, if you're Auburn, like you need to do something in the SEC tournament, right? I
Yeah.
mean, no team has ever gotten an at-large bid with 16 losses. And I mean, Auburn could, in theory, be the first if it doesn't win the auto bid, which I mean, it probably won't. Just speaking on just math and likeliness. So, I mean, if you're Auburn, I think you still have to win, probably at least 2 games to, feel pretty good. But even then, you're still asking to be the first ever 16 loss at large team.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we go into this and honestly it's one of those weird situations where like the I feel like rarely do we have they have the last four in and then the first four buys or whatever. Like usually I feel like they're all kind of close together. It feels to me like the fact that Auburn is still projected as the last team in right now, at least by ESPN, and then Missouri and Texas are on like that next four. Like it just feels like there's a huge gap to where like a Missouri and Texas, I guess,
Missouri and
in
Texas feel
theory,
pretty
yeah, they
close.
they in theory go into this on the bubble, but there's just such a gap I feel like right now between those last few at large spots to where I feel like they're feeling good. And then the other team, like we said, is Oklahoma, that they could go in there and make some noise because like if at least if the you never know what the committee is going to base things off of year to year. Sometimes they follow the same thing, but if you're looking on just like how a team is playing recently, it is hard to argue with Oklahoma what they've done recently. But I mean, goodness gracious, they dug themselves in a hole. So
Yeah, if that Oklahoma team gets an at-large bid, then
now,
forget talk
yeah,
of tournament.
it is just one of those things where I'm looking at it. I'm like Oklahoma. I feel better about Oklahoma right now than Auburn, but it's a whole body of work. I get it, but goodness, if Auburn makes the tournament this year too, that'll be. I just feel like this is the type of year that we're like we talked about this way earlier. Uh, we talked about it last fall whenever the tournament expansion talk happened. I was like, this is the type of year that makes me be like, why are we talking about expanding it? If anything, reduce
Oh,
it.
yeah, no, go back to 64. Get rid of the first four.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's
It's so gross. Like Oklahoma, I saw Oklahoma on a Next 4 outlet recently, and like I almost vomited. That team, like, I know they've played well of late. That team should be nowhere close to the tournament. Auburn shouldn't be anywhere close to the tournament. They've got 16 losses,
Yeah.
or 16 losses, and will have 16 if they don't win the auto bid.
Well,
But ugh,
there will be a whole lot more to talk about with the SEC tournament as the week goes on. It's a busy week in general, Razorback sports. I know baseball's going on today. There's obviously going to be baseball and softball series this weekend. There's spring football starting this coming Sunday. A lot going on, Razorback coverage. But we will have you covered with all of it. You can go and check out our work at wholehogsports.com. We'll have a lot of coverage from Nashville with Anthony there. We'll have a lot of coverage from Baum Walker today. Matt Jones is there. And we'll be back with another podcast tomorrow, everyone. Have a great day.